Good afternoon, guys. So, welcome to Live with LAI. I hope you're having a, well, maybe not close to perfect, but at least great and awesome Thursday afternoon. Last week was a very short week for most of us. This week, we're back to regular operations. Okay, so today's topic is the consideration if would you or would you not rehire a former employee. So the term that's been used these days for former employees who are interested again to apply with the company or rejoin the company is what we call boomerang employees, right? So from my view, there are three things that I would usually consider very deeply before I make the decision or before I would recommend if the organization is to hire or rehire a former employee. So to start off, let me share with you point number 1. Remember what they always say, that you shouldn't burn bridges, right? Never burn a bridge unless you're pretty sure that you won't cross that bridge ever again. But the thing is, in today's economy, today's markets, the world has gotten to so much smaller. Okay, circles have actually become so much smaller as well. So first thing that you would need to consider when a former employee is interested to rejoin the company is the exit. Right? So I'm not just talking about the exit interviews. The exit interviews capture only the tip of the iceberg of resigned or a terminated or an exiting employee. What you have to consider was the exit graceful? Did the employee leave on a positive or negative note? Did the employee leave in a positive note but with some reservations, right? Judgment call would be for employees who left the company on a negative note, perhaps not going through the employee clearance process. I would think not just twice but thrice in considering that employee's application. Kind of like a relationship. So it's Thursday, so there's this thing what we call Hugot Thursdays for Filipinos, and I'm sure you millennials out there can relate to that. Exiting your employer, if you exited on a bad note, is like breaking up with a former flame without closure, right? So considering rehiring a former employee is like considering would you get back with an ex-boyfriend, right? Not to be too dramatic, of course, but if you look at relationships, essentially they have the same factors, okay? The exits of employees also are what most of us in HR would remember more than usually what happened in the entire life cycle of that former employee. So the phrase also applies when you say it's not the entrance that counts, but it's actually the exit. So my advice to all those fresh graduates looking for their first job, if you are to leave within less than a year of your first job, just make sure every time you leave, you have a good exit. You may not have to be buddies with whoever who conducting your exit interview, but be professional enough to continue with a clear and complete exit process. Giving feedback to those people in charge is also helpful. Because again, these days, you never know if you will need to cross that bridge again or if your career compass redirects you to that bridge again. Okay? All right. The second thing that you will need or want to consider if you are to rehire a former employee is what I would say the former employee's value add. right? Two things when we talk about value add. You would consider the boomerang employees' value add to the current culture of the company, and you would also consider the former employees' value add to the business operations. Let's go to business operations first. Okay. Bringing in this former employee, you would consider, does he bring in additional skill sets? Is the organization ready to pay his required compensation? Is he actually requesting a higher compensation than those who are already inside the organization? You would also consider if the former employee is to be hired under the same role in which they left, the major factor that comes into play in business operations is the cost factor, right? If cost is not an issue, then definitely you consider skill. Now, assuming that the former employee brings in added skill, okay, that's a positive note. Assuming again on the reverse side that the employee does not bring much into value in terms of added skill, you may want to delve deeper again. Would it be more business operations wise to hire internally or promote internally rather than bringing in a former employee into the same role? Or you might also be able to look into the option bringing in the former employee but to a different role. Now, it gets tricky when you're talking about rank and file versus senior people. Okay, senior rehires or senior boomerang employees, definitely the consideration of added experience is there, because aside from considering their exits, in the time that they were outside or they left the company, did they learn anything new? Do they bring you a competitive advantage in terms of the market that you're involved in? Hiring this senior role or rehiring this senior role, how would it impact your current management team? Okay, that's the dynamics of bringing in that former employee comes into play, right? So still on value add, we consider the value add to the current culture. A lot of reapplying boomerang employees generally and normally would expect that they would have the same benefits that they left when they return to the company. It would be good to set the right expectations from the very beginning if there have been changes in the benefits or the policies. For example, let's say during employee A's time with the company, let's say cost or budget was not an issue or head count was not an issue, so the company could afford to send all its employees on company outings outside of the country. Okay, because at that time, let's say the company headcount was at less than 50, so it was not much of a consideration cost-wise. Fast forward later, let's say the company has now grown to a headcount of 150, and then let's say we have a senior manager wanting to rejoin the company, but he expects that he would still be included in the company outing overseas trips. If that practice no longer happens, us in people operations or HR, we need to set that expectation that currently there's been a change in the benefits. Okay. Of course, that all boils down to how you phrase the contract. It is safe for the business to always put boomerang or rejoining or returning former hires through the probationary period first before regularizing them. Of course, it's still company prerogative if you rehire that former employee and immediately put them into a regular status. But the years in HR and in dealing with these kind of applications, it's not only a personal insight, it's also a gut feel, and it's also a safe practice to put in a probationary period for former employees. This also shows your current employees that the process is the same, regardless of whether you're a returning employee or a fresh applicant. It sets the stage to say that, no one is above the process, or it breaks the notion of, say, favoritism or extended favors, right? But then again, that would still be left to the business to decide on, right? Okay, so first one I mentioned earlier, consider the employee's exit. Second one you need to consider the employee's value add in terms of culture and in terms of business operations, right? Third and final, or most crucial actually, that you will need to consider if you would rehire a former employee is the why, or the reason why they exited or they left the organization to begin with, right? A simple example. Let's say again, we go back to employee A, that 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 2 years ago, the reason why he left the company was he could not get along with his immediate supervisor. It was not an issue of performance. It was not an issue of policy. It was just that the dynamics were too harsh for him, that he could not work under a particular immediate supervisor. Now, things have changed. Enough time has passed, maybe 2 years, 3 years, that particular supervisor also has moved on and is no longer with the company. So employee A wants to return. Now, if everything works out and this returning employee brings value for the organization, and that you deep dive and the reason for him leaving is just really a matter of relationship with his former boss or former leader, then by all means, I would say rehire. But getting into the reasons of why employees leave, one other reason could be, is it compensation, right? For employees that leave because of compensation, I highly advise that during the rehiring process, we deep dive into their salary expectations at present. Because let's say the former employee at the time they made the exit was single, and now that they are returning to the organization, they're married with one or two kids, or not to make the conversation more sad, but in reality it happens. When the employee exited, let's say parents were still healthy and able to take care of themselves and were employed, but now upon returning on the second rehiring of the employee, let's say one of the parents is actually in their old age and suffering from illness or disease or sickness, which puts the employee at a more unstable, not really, or maybe a more with more responsibilities financially to the family. So you would have to deep dive again into the expectations of that employee. Also, I think figuring out the why the employee is returning, if the reason again is, say, culture now. Let's say when the employee left, he felt that the organization was too box type, or too disciplinary, or too straight for him, too strict. And maybe he's heard that there's new management or there's new approaches inside the company, and that gives the reason for his return, all other factors considered, I would say consider the rehire. Okay? So all of these things come into play when making the decision. So make sure to actually know the reasons for the former exit, what drove the decision to exit in the first place. 2, consider the returning employee's value add in terms of culture and in terms of business operations. And also, the third would be consider the why, right? So all 3 things considered, I think you would be able to come up to an objective assessment of whether you would rehire or not boomerang employees. Again, the most general rule of thumb would be, if you treat it like would you or would you not get into a relationship again with a former flame. All things considered, I know it's a bit cheesy, but if you consider the factors, they're almost the same. Okay. One thing I'd like to share is that we have scheduled, or we'll be sharing HR tips of the week every Monday. The details of that will be announced on the Facebook page, and please keep on interacting with the page, keep on viewing us to learn more of the schedules and the tips that we will be releasing in the next few weeks. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to interact with the team. Join our HR Innovators group. Look out on Sprout Solutions page. They have a lot of material there for us for reference in all the things that we do in HR and people operations. Okay, so that will be it for today. I hope you guys learned something from today's sharing. I hope that it guides you in assessing your rehires, whether for whatever reason that they may bring into the company. We have to admit that rehires bring easier onboarding with them. So with that, you guys have a very good afternoon and a very great evening ahead. It looks good outside. I don't see any rain from my view. So we're gonna have a very good evening. No storms or no lightning bolts so far. That's an added forecast for you. Okay? So have a nice evening ahead. Have a great Friday tomorrow. And you all have a very restful weekend.